Hey there, I'm Jessica Lauren Walton, and this is my interview corner. If there's a cool story in the security field or just something that I think will be valuable for my fellow professionals, then I want to talk about it. To learn more about the work I do as a writer, you can go ahead and visit my blog at www.jessicawaltonwriter.com. Today's guest is Michael Sugrue, a former police sergeant and U.S. Air Force Security Forces captain. I'm a big fan of his book, Relentless Courage, which he co-authored with psychologist Dr. Shauna Springer. We're going to talk about this book today. It is not easy for anyone to speak about trauma, but when it comes to the security field, this issue is especially complicated. So I'm very impressed with Michael, the way he authentically talks about both the challenges and triumphs of his police career in Walnut Creek, California. He also has a lot of valuable insights to share about a particular traumatic shooting incident he was involved in, including the aftermath of that incident that I believe has so many important lessons for other police departments. If you happen to be a police officer tuning in today who is struggling with mental health issues, then this episode is definitely for you. So let's get in there and start talking to Michael. Hi, Michael. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to talk to you about your book. And not only did I read the entire thing, I read the entire thing in one day. So I was definitely engrossed by it. And it's interesting. I want to mention also you co-authored it with Shauna Doc Springer. And I found out that this term doc is actually a special nickname or moniker for somebody, a psychologist who works really like in the security field, who has that kind of intimate knowledge of the culture. So that was interesting for me to learn. And I just wanted to say about the structure of the book. So when I initially was opening your book, reading through the intro, and I saw that this is a story, about not only your career as a police officer, but also it's wrapped around a specific shooting incident and unpacking the trauma you went through, talking about, what was going on externally and internally, but it was interspersed with chapters with Shauna kind of unpacking what you're saying as if you were a patient, in her room being analyzed. And at first I was like, oh man, that's going to feel disjointed going back and forth. But I actually really liked that structure. I wanted to say that I just felt like you're, kind of bringing this 360 perspective, walking, someone, either a civilian from the outside or another police officer through your experience, and then also having, the benefit of a professional like Shauna kind of explaining, what was going on, like bigger picture. So I just wanted to compliment you and Shauna on that accomplishment. I thought it was a great read. And like I said, I finished it in one day. So yeah, so
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's great. So tell me a bit about your personal story and the incident that led you to ultimately write your book, Relentless Courage.
It's a long story, so I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. But for me, my interest in law enforcement and the military went all the way back to childhood. So I knew at literally 8 years old that this was my calling. This is what I wanted to do. And so my whole life, I had a plan. Like everything, I was checking the boxes, right? So I went off to college. I went straight into the military as an Air Force officer in security forces. I did 6.5 years active duty. I served all over the world, including South America, the Middle East, and Europe. I got out in 2004 and I went straight into civilian law enforcement here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the Walnut Creek Police Department. Had a very successful career. Started off as just a regular officer, and then I was a field training officer. I was a detective. I was undercover on a state drug task force, basically like the California DEA. And then I was promoted to sergeant 8 years on. And literally, my life was perfect. Happily married, beautiful daughter, just bought my dream house. I thought that I would be chief of police someday. That was my goal. And my second solo week as a brand new sergeant, my shift started the day after Christmas. So we worked 9:30 at night till 7:30 in the morning. And this was our Friday. So I was going to be off for several days after this shift. Was very excited. Remember going into work, I had minimum staffing. It was very slow, not much going on. We did have another team on and a lieutenant who was working, but they went home around 1 a.m. And then about 3 in the morning, it was just dead silent for hours. Our female dispatcher gets on the radio, her voice just extremely frantic. She starts putting out the address on Creekside Drive and says that there's a woman inside a condominium and a man armed with a knife. And so immediately I just start driving as fast as I can to that location. I can hear all the other officers answering up and they're going as well. Now this location is a condominium complex, which I know the general area, but I don't know where the specific unit is. About halfway there, and again, this is a very short amount of time, the dispatcher gets back on the radio and says now the boyfriend and girlfriend are barricaded inside their bedroom. And I was confused, so I actually asked for clarification on the radio. And I said, is the boyfriend the one with the knife? Or is there a third subject with a knife? And the dispatcher quickly said, no, there's a third subject armed with a knife. And to this point, I mean, I can just feel the adrenaline rush. My heart is beating extremely fast. I'm just envisioning what I'm going to see and encounter. And from the start, this call was just very unusual. As I get to the location, I pull up in front of this large complex. And as I start to get out of my car, the dispatcher starts screaming out. She's like, units, units, there's a struggle, there's a struggle. And she loses all communication inside the condominium. And as I get out, at the same time, I can hear a female screaming in the distance. I mean, to this day, one of the worst sounds I've ever heard, literally screaming for her life. And thank God at that same time, one of my officers, a female officer, pulled up right behind me. We literally pulled our guns out, we looked at each other, and we just started running towards the sounds of these screams. I remember we had to crawl underneath an outside stairwell, and we get into this open courtyard, and there's two-story attached condominiums all around us. We find the unit, and then it goes just dead silent from these blood-curdling screams to just eerie silence. I don't remember hearing any noises, seeing anybody outside in the entire complex. And now we're announcing ourselves. It's just her and I. I have more officers on the way, but we know that there's a couple inside that we have to help save. And there's no response. I try kicking open the door. It doesn't work. My partner's posted up at this large window. It's a louvered window the size of a door. And it's completely shattered into the condominium. So we both go to the window. We're announcing ourselves, police, come out, show us your hands. Nothing. And we look at each other. She goes in first. I go right behind her. Immediately, we're in this kitchen area, and I can see there's a cutout where there's like a family room and a dining room area downstairs. So we exit the kitchen. She goes right, which puts her at the base of a stairwell. And behind her is a locked front door. I go left, and I clear that family room, dining room area. I don't see anybody. I don't find anything unusual or suspicious other than, of course, the kitchen area because there's glass everywhere and it was a mess. So now I rejoin my partner at the bottom of the stairs. We're literally shoulder to shoulder. I can feel her on my right. To her right is a solid wall and there's a staircase. As we look up, there's some kind of opening on the top left. We don't know if it's a hallway, if it's a bedroom, but we can see there's something up there. And so our guns are out, flashlights are on, we're pointing straight up the stairwell. Again, police, come out, show us your hands, show us your hands. Moments later, a male subject partially comes out, just sweating profusely, his eyes wide open, just glazed over, staring straight through us as if we're not there. And we can't see the entire right side of his body. And so again, we got our guns out, pointed up, and we're yelling at him, show us your hands, show us your hands. No visible reaction. I don't remember his eyes blinking. I don't remember any facial expressions. I don't remember body movement. I mean, literally just staring straight through us. At some point, two other officers enter the condominium, and I yell for one of them to get the taser, which is less than lethal force. And so there's another female officer and a male officer. The male officer says, I've got the taser. He positions right behind myself and that first female officer that arrived on scene. The last officer goes perpendicular to the stairwell, and she can't really see what's going on at the top of the stairwell. So now the male subject comes fully out, and my partner yells, "He's got a knife! He's got a knife!" And in his right hand, he was clenching a full-size butcher knife. And so now we're yelling, "Drop the knife! Drop the knife!" Again, no reaction. Moments later, he takes the knife up in a stabbing position and starts coming towards us. I shoot, other officers shoot. I don't know if I've hit him. He's now at the bottom of the stairs. The two female officers relocate to the dining room, living room area. The male officer that had the taser drops that. He has his firearm out. And now, literally, this subject is at the bottom of the stairwell, still holding the butcher knife in his right hand. I don't see any blood. I don't see any injuries. Again, we're not sure if we hit him or not. All we know is he's between us and the couple that's upstairs, and we've got to get to them. So we don't know if they're dying, if they're bleeding out. And so now we're yelling, "Drop the knife, drop the knife." And he starts coming back up again with a knife. I mean, literally right in front of us. And we shoot. And this time it was absolutely devastating. I mean, I could see just lethal wounds. I mean, it was horrible. And we already had medical staging. I had an officer check his vitals, and there were none. And we called radio dispatch and said, "Send in medical." I had two officers go upstairs to check on the couple. And thank God we got there and we did, because this guy had been stabbing through the bedroom door with this butcher knife. And this poor couple was physically barricading their bodies against the door, trying to prevent him from coming in and killing them. But that incident just set off a whole series of events through investigations, lawsuits, just eventually a downward spiral of my life, where I got to the point where I didn't want to be here anymore. I suffered in silence for 4 years, and I literally wanted to die in the line of duty.
Well, thank you for sharing that story, that particular incident. I'm sure it's really hard to have to share that over and over again and to relive it. I know that you're sharing this and unpacking this story for the benefit of others. So tell me, what led you to want to write a book about it? Because this is something, understandably, a lot of people would say, "Hey, I went through this really awful experience. I want to put it behind me. I don't want to talk about it again." But you kind of rose up and said, I want to talk about it. I want to talk about it for others. So what led you to that decision?
You know, it's been quite a journey. So I'll backtrack a little bit. So the shooting happened the end of December 2012.
Mm-hmm.
I endured a 4-year federal lawsuit where I ended up a defendant on trial in court in San Francisco. You know, I lost my marriage. I lost my stepfather, was my hero. I got diagnosed with repeated skin cancer. Like, literally everything in my life was just falling apart. And I finally got the strength and courage to ask for help on the anniversary of my shooting in 2016. And so my initial plan was to, try to get better and go back to work. That was always my plan. But then I faced some serious administrative betrayal and institutional betrayal, which I talk about in depth in my book. And unfortunately, it got to the point where I had to medically retire in 2018, in the summer of 2018. And at that time, I was still embarrassed. I was still ashamed. And I didn't talk to anybody other than my therapist and people I'd worked with in different first responder support groups and programs. But most of my friends and coworkers did not know about my post-traumatic stress. They didn't know about all the things I had endured and suffered through. And about a year after my retirement, a guy I didn't know, his name was Danny Bird. He was a former police officer, and he had a podcast. And I was into fitness, and his podcast was about fitness. And he asked me if I'd be willing to come on his show and talk about, mental health and post-traumatic stress. And I told him I'm not interested. Like, I appreciate it, but that's not my thing. But thanks for thinking of me. And thank goodness this guy, I mean, he harassed me and bothered me, and I'm so glad he did, because
He was relentless. Speaking of the title of
no,
your book, he was relentless. He came after you. He really
was.
wanted you to share that story.
Yes, and that's the thing, is that and I know now, he had his own trauma and own things that he had to deal with, but it got to the point where he's like, "Look, man," he's like, "I will drive the 2.5 hours to you. You just tell me where to meet. I'll make it happen." And so finally, I agreed to do it. And I'm that kind of guy where if I agree to do something, I'm not going to back out as much as I wanted to. And so it's funny. He drove the 2.5 hours. I picked this Mimi's Cafe. I thought we were going to have breakfast, get to know each other, have some coffee. And I go to the back of the restaurant and there's a video camera set up. There's two computers, headphones. He's already drinking his coffee and he's like, I'm really sorry to do this, but I got to be back in San Jose and we only have an hour. So we got to do this like right now. And so I remember I sat down and you can still hear the Mimi's Cafe music in the background. It's kind of funny. It's real faint in the interview. And he just starts asking me questions. And this was the thing is that I didn't think about like, how should I answer this or how should I frame this or how is this going to come across? Like literally, I just answered straight from my heart. And the thing was, is that I'd been keeping this all in. I was so ashamed and so embarrassed. So by doing that, it was like this, I just felt this burden come off my shoulders, that here I am sharing this with somebody. And a couple weeks later, when he aired this episode, it was kind of like I couldn't control it anymore. Like it was all out there for the world to see and hear. And, instead of getting what I thought would be, messages putting me down or, just being disrespectful or shameful, I actually got messages from all over the world, from the UK, from Australia, from all over the US, of people, Canada,
Mm.
where they said, I listened to the interview and this resonated with me or that resonated with me. And here's my story. And they started sharing with me. And so that right there set me off on a path where I was doing podcast after podcast after podcast, which eventually led to public speaking, where I started speaking just locally, for small agencies. And eventually I was speaking across the entire United States. And so fast forward to right before COVID, Dr. Shauna Springer, amazing, amazing woman. She's a clinical psychologist. She's worked with combat veterans and first responders most of her career. So she truly gets us. She truly understands it. And I didn't know her. She didn't know me, but she reached out to me on LinkedIn again, which is how this podcast got started. And she
Yeah.
says, hey, I would just like to see, what you're doing and tell you about the work I'm doing. And I was like, yeah, sure, let's do this. And so she calls me up. And the crazy thing was, first off, is that it turns out she lived in the city that I was a police officer. We
Right.
never knew each other. We never met. And so that was really cool. And then she starts
Mhm.
telling me about the stellate ganglion block, which is a medical procedure to treat post-traumatic stress. And at the time, I was really skeptical, I'll be honest. I was like telling myself, like, yeah, this sounds too good to be true. I don't know about that. So,
Mhm.
but I've since had it done and we talk about it in the book. It's an amazing procedure. But so then she's like, hey, tell me your story. And so I tell her my story all the way back to childhood into present day. And trust me when I tell you this, there's much, much more than this shooting. That was kind of just like the tip of the
Right.
iceberg. And afterwards, she says, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I said, well, it's funny that you asked me that because I have been asked that before. I said, but I honestly don't know that I have the drive and the motivation to get something like that done. And so we just left the conversation at that. Couple months later, she hits me back up and she goes, I've really been thinking about this. And she said, I've heard hundreds and hundreds of trauma stories, but your story is sticking with me. And I think your story is going to help countless people. And she said, I want to make this book happen. And we hadn't even met in person. And I said, I knew in my heart, I said, let's do it. And then COVID happened. And we actually did this project the first year via
A
Zoom,
lot of
like
people
literally
started
two.
new projects during COVID. COVID was a
Yeah,
great time for everyone to write a book. Yeah.
right. But we did it on Zoom like 2 hours a week. We never met until like a year into this. And that's the thing is
But you
that
live
I
near each
never,
other. You live near each
yeah,
other and you met on LinkedIn. So I didn't realize that. I thought you were just kind of friends from the neighborhood. Yeah, that's pretty wild.
no, no, no. Yeah, we're about 35 minutes away from each other. But like I said, our
Cool.
paths never crossed. We never met. And like I said, everything happens for a reason. I truly believe that. And this book is so unique. And like you mentioned, the format, I don't know of anything else out there like it because it has, a gripping, true, just no holds barred story from a first responder, military member. But then you have the doctor that comes in every single chapter and she breaks it down. She explains it in layman's terms so that anybody
Right.
reading this book, whether or not you're in the field or not in the field, You could just be a random person on the street. You're now going to see the real human behind the badge and the uniform. And so, again, I didn't envision or plan any of this. It's all kind of just fallen into place. And I look back now and, I literally had to walk through hell and back, but I now know that there's a reason for that. And I'm here now to do something about it and to smash this stigma of mental health. And so that's what my mission in life is now. I mean, that's what drives me. That's what gives me my purpose. And life is all about having purpose.
Yeah, and I think that's true for so many people who work in the security field. I know it's a very difficult transition for veterans in particular going into the civilian world, finding a job that they can still find satisfying. And my response to that is find something that is mission focused, continue being a mission focused person, because that's obviously what gives you satisfaction. So you retired from the police and you've found this new mission, which in a way is continuing to support the police. I think it's very interesting also. Shauna's not just any psychologist. She's not a generalist. She's somebody who specializes, in security, professional issues. And I recently attended the screening of PTSD 911. It's a documentary by filmmaker Conrad Weaver. I don't know if you've heard of it. You should definitely see it. It talks about PTSD in the first responder community. And there were first responders interviewed who said, like, I've seen such horrific stuff that when I saw a therapist, like just a general therapist, like totally outside, their department, I made the therapist cry. And you don't want to have situations like that either, right? So you really have to have, I think that's an important thing, is to have, professional, psychologists, professionals who are their education is kind of tailored to treat people, in the police or in the security field. So I think that's amazing that you guys were able to hook up and to work on this book project together. So I want to talk about some of not just that initial trauma of the shooting incident itself, which you laid out in such a compelling visual way. Like I could see it while you're, describing it. But also the things that compounded the trauma afterwards, that you were separated, right? And I understand that there is a legal need to separate you from the other officers, but there were, incidents like that, and having to go through the court cases and everything that really just added to that trauma. And I know this is a complicated, issue, but, is there something that do you think there's something departments could do differently, following a traumatic event to kind of mitigate the effects of that trauma so it doesn't, explode and become worse, like full-blown PTSD for an officer?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it comes down to the culture of an agency. So, at the time back in 2012, my agency was actually very progressive. Like we had a peer support team, we did, annual trainings, we had a contracted therapist who was culturally competent, who was very good. And the problem is that, first of all, I now, know that this therapist, I trust her with my life because I've worked with her, I've talked with her. But at the time,
Mhm.
I had not built that relationship with her before my shooting happened. And same with the peer support people. The people that were on the team were, nice people. But in my eyes, they hadn't been through similar situations. They weren't people that necessarily I would trust or want to confide in. And looking back, if I would have already had established relationships with a culturally competent therapist, with peer support people, either at my agency or another agency, that if I would have had people that I could legally confide in and trust, I think that would have made a critical difference. As an example, after our shooting, we had the initial interview that morning from the district attorney's office. And about a week later, we had an internal affairs investigation interview. Now, after that was the first time that we all got to see each other after the shooting, as far as the involved officers and the dispatcher. And we had a critical incident debrief with a culturally competent therapist, which is a great idea, and you should have this. But my point to this is that when we were there, and I was the leader, I was the supervisor, and this is where I messed up because by that point, I'm already having nightmares. I'm already having sleeping issues. And again, post-traumatic stress, some of it is immediate, but a lot of it is gradual, and it takes time to kind of evolve. And so, at that point, I wouldn't say I was like too far gone or really messed up, but I could see that some things were starting to happen in my life. Like I felt numb at home. I felt very distant from my wife at the time and my daughter. And instead of using that opportunity and that critical incident debrief myself to open up and start just openly talking about this stuff, I didn't do that. In fact, nobody in that room did that. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
so this critical incident debrief, we're there, we've got this culturally competent therapist, and the point is to actually, talk about the trauma, to talk about the effects of what we saw and what we had to deal with. But none of us used that time to do that. We all used it as literally just a time to fill in the gaps, to find out the facts of what happened that day. And I remember that we were so in such a hurry to all go back to work. And I think a lot of that was because we were worried about what would other people think. If we're off too long, then are people going to question us? Are they going to question whether or not we can handle this job? And so, I can't speak for the other officers, but speaking for myself, it was like, no, let's just get back to work as quick as we can. Let's pretend like this didn't happen and move on with our lives. But, going back to my original point, if we all would have had this established trust, and not just with the therapist, but more importantly with ourselves, because, people aren't going to open up unless the person they're open up to is vulnerable themselves. Exactly. And that's what I think is key to just
Mm-hmm.
the solution is so simple when you think about it, but it's so complicated because the culture, that's what sets it. And, it starts in the academy or it starts in boot camp if you're in the military. We're trained to be warriors, we're trained to feel invincible, and we're expected to go into the most dangerous situations that nobody else will go into, and to bring calm and order to absolute chaos, right? So we have to do that. That's part of our job. And I think there's this mentality that if we ever talk about our feelings or emotions, that somehow that's going to make us weak and it's going to make us vulnerable. And that's not the truth. What I've learned is that, when I finally asked for help, it took strength and courage. In fact, it was the hardest, bravest, most courageous thing I ever did was actually asking for help. It wasn't anything I did during that shooting. It was nothing I did when I was in the military. It was literally raising my hand and asking for help. And so if we just normalize these conversations, they don't have to be big deals. We don't have to have critical incident debriefs for everything. I mean, sure, for the major incidents, but as an example, let's say my patrol team, we all go to a horrific car accident. Maybe it's a pedestrian who gets hit in a crosswalk. And after we take care of the business, we leave the scene. Afterwards, if we just, talk about it and say, look, I just want to acknowledge that that was really rough today. Going out there and seeing that poor little girl in the crosswalk, that really messed me up today. I'm just kind of venting. I'm just kind of talking about it. But that act alone is getting that off my chest. It's acknowledging the humanity. And yeah, we can eventually go on and carry on our business. So I'm saying this doesn't have to be a big deal as long as we normalize it. But that's the key, is how do we get to that point, right? So the answer is we start in the training academies, but we've got all these people that are currently working. So we have to carry that through the ranks, and we have to have people like myself or leaders who are currently in their own agencies to talk about this stuff openly in front of the entire department and change this culture.
Right. So you're saying that it starts with leadership. And I think there is this difficult balancing act for security professionals who work in high intensity roles that, yes, you are warriors. You have to be above average physically and mentally. Absolutely. But I think it can be very difficult. Like, you have to turn off your emotions for certain situations so you can act, so you can survive. But then in other contexts, you need to be able to turn those emotions back on and be able to have self-awareness, to be able to be brave enough, as you point out, to communicate with others, to say, I'm struggling. And I think those are very important skills that maybe need to be taught really early on, and to say, hey, these are the things you're going to face. And these are probably feelings that you might have after certain incidents. And that's normal. So I think when people don't think they're normal, when they see everyone else who's quiet around them after an incident, they think they're the one who's abnormal, when everybody is most likely thinking the same thing. So I think that's just really, it's like deceptively simple, but it's really powerful, just being able to speak up, So it's no secret. in the security community that there is a high suicide rate, not just among police officers, but among first responders. There are more suicides than people dying in the line of duty. And this has been going on for years. But interestingly, it was not until recently, like maybe the last 2 or 3 years, that people outside the security community are becoming aware of the suicide rate. We're seeing it more in the news. We're seeing in social media. And my question to you is why now? If this has been going on for so long, if this has been an issue for an extended period of time, why are we just finding out now about this issue with the suicide rate in the first responder community?
I think a lot of it was swept under the rug. A lot of it was hidden, and honestly, I'll give you a perfect example. Most people don't think about this, but let's say you have a police officer who's in their patrol car and they crash into a tree or a sound wall with no seatbelt. It's a horrific accident, right? So if there's an accident on duty and an officer dies, their family's taken care of financially. Like the family's going to be okay. But if an officer commits suicide on duty, the family gets nothing. I mean, they're literally out there on their own with no support, no financial security. And so let's just say that an agency knows that this horrific car accident was actually a suicide. Are they going to say it's a suicide, or are they going to say it's a horrific accident? And here's the real dilemma, because by classifying that as a suicide, what are you now doing to the surviving family, right? So I think that's part of it, and I think it's a small part of it. But if you go back to 2016, there was a group called Blue Help, and it's called First Help now. At first, they're the ones that really are kind of instrumental in exposing these suicide numbers, and they only started with law enforcement, and that's why it was called Blue Help. And they've since expanded to paramedics, dispatchers, firefighters, and police officers. And they're the ones that really started doing training. They started pushing these numbers out, and people were just in shock. Like they had no idea. And like I said, this is not something new. This has been going on for a very long time. And so they've been tracking the numbers since 2016. And like you said, year over year, these numbers outnumber the line of duty deaths. And so I think it's because of organizations like them who have basically inspired and encouraged other people to speak out. And they're there to support the surviving family members and spouses. I think more people are getting comfortable about talking about this stuff, basically peeling back this veil and exposing the reality of it. Because let's face it, suicide is affecting our entire society, and it always has. But especially since COVID, when COVID happened, we saw a sharp increase in suicide, both for first responders, military, and just the general public. So I think in general, the public is becoming better informed on this stuff, right? But historically, I think the public has accepted the military, right? So we hear military, we understand that they may have post-traumatic stress disorder. I prefer injury as a term, PTSI. But for some reason, the public doesn't equate first responders as having it as well. But when you look at it, first responders over their entire career are usually exposed to many more traumatic events, hundreds and hundreds of traumatic events. And our police officers are literally in combat every single day for 20, 30 plus years. And so, the military's done a great job as far as educating, not just the military members, but the public on suicide prevention, suicide awareness, treatment for post-traumatic stress. And so now you see law enforcement, firefighters, paramedics, dispatchers who are following suit. And now they're getting better and better about talking about this and training on it and exposing it. But we still have so much more work to do in this area.
And it sounds like there's also a lot of benefit to police departments across counties or across states communicating with each other. I don't know what the infrastructure has looked like the last few decades, if you guys have been fairly siloed from each other, or if there is, a certain amount of information training between departments across the country.
Every state's different, even every county. I mean, I speak all
Yeah.
over the United States, and I hate to say it, and I'm not going to dime out specific states or areas, but I go to some areas and I'm in shock of how behind the times they are. and the horror stories that I hear when officers have tried to ask for help and how they're
Mhm.
outcasted and placed on an island by themselves where nobody wants to be associated with them and they have no support whatsoever. So, yeah, unfortunately, it's not across the board that we're talking about. And, like in some states, post traumatic stress disorder is presumptive if you're a first responder. And there are worker comp benefits, there's medical benefits, there's potential retirement benefits, but there's other states where it's not presumptive. And if they get post traumatic stress disorder and they have to leave law enforcement, let's say, they have nothing. They have no support, they have no benefits. And so, yeah, I mean, it needs some things need to be standardized, whether it's at the federal level or the state level. And we need to do a better job about talking with each other about this epidemic.
And it sounds like from your book that it's very important to have clarity of communications internally to make sure, like, don't assume that all your officers know what the policy is, what the consequence is, for certain actions. Make sure that people are really on the same page, even if that means doing like an annual training. And I know so many people in so many jobs roll their eyes at annual trainings, but just to remind people, like, hey, this is where we stand on XYZ issues. And this is what would happen if you asked for help or if you had certain symptoms, right? Because just not knowing is so scary that it makes you not want to ask for help because you don't want to see your career burned to the ground overnight, potentially. And that might not even be the case. It might be that your department would get you sufficient help, put you on leave, bring you back, to work. But if you don't know that, it's going to probably stop you from asking for help in the first place. And then as your story demonstrates, you started off with certain symptoms of PTSD, but then it snowballed over time and got worse. And your story could have looked a lot different if you had had early prevention, early
Absolutely.
intervention. Yeah.
And on the flip side of that, if somebody, let's say an officer or firefighter of agency does ask for help, but then they don't get that help and they get placed out on an island, right? They get outcasted. Well, then nobody's going to ask for help. That's what I'm saying is people are watching. Like when somebody asks for help, everybody in that
Mhm.
organization, they're going to be watching to see how that person's treated, to see how they're supported. And if they see that they're not getting any support and that this might ruin their career or ruin, potential for promotion or assignments, they're never going to ask for help. They're going to suffer in silence like I did for 4 years or longer. And that's what's going to eventually cost them their life.
Right. If you get the early intervention, you have a better chance of rehabilitating and coming back to your career as opposed to letting it get so bad that you have to be medically retired, for example. I think that's a really important message to share with people. Absolutely. So now we're kind of segueing into my next question, which is about stigma. And I follow you on LinkedIn, and I know you are super passionate about smashing that stigma, as am I. So stigma stands in the way of so many police officers and other security professionals from seeking help. So why do you think this stigma surrounding mental health has such a strong grip on the police, and what practical steps can be taken to mitigate it?
We talked about this a little bit earlier, but it all
Mhm.
starts in the training academy. It all starts with building you up and making you confident and making you feel like a warrior. And then, like I said, there's a purpose for that. And so most all the training that's done in the police academy is geared towards, use of firearms, defensive tactics, arrest and control techniques, report writing, driving, but not much, if any, is focused on mental health awareness of ourselves. We're trained on how to deal with people on the street as far as if we have to evaluate them if they're a danger to themselves or others. But you never have people like myself go into a police academy and say, hey, look, I know you guys are all excited. You're just starting out and you want to go out there and hit the streets running, but hey, let me just give you a heads up on some things that may happen down the road. When you have a few years on and may things happen with your family or your loved ones, it's like you need to plant that seed to show that this is real. Like you can be a warrior and you can be a badass for so long, but eventually this stuff is going to catch up to you unless you deal with it or acknowledge it. And so, you really have to set it there. And same thing, whether that's having, I think the best thing is having people from their own agency instead of having people like myself come in. I mean, I don't mind coming in, and I think it's great that I come in, but I think it's even more powerful if somebody from their own agency gets up, speaks in front of the entire department, and shares. Because I'll give you a perfect example. I spoke at an agency here in Northern California. I met with the chief before I spoke, and he told me about this lieutenant. I later met him. They had had an annual peer support training. It wasn't planned. Nobody knew this was going to happen, but this lieutenant decided at the training to just get up and open up about all these things he had endured and how he came out the other side of it. And the thing was that nobody in the agency, other than like the chief and the captain, knew anything about this because he was so good at putting up this image in this front that everything's okay. So all these officers were like in shock because they had no clue that this, decorated police lieutenant in the administration had endured all these things. They just thought he was, living an easy life and everything was going great. It's like, no. But that's the thing is we're all so good at putting up that front. So if we can get people in agencies, especially people in key leadership positions to do that, like, could you imagine having a police chief of an organization of hundreds of people to get out there in front of everybody and say, look, I'm going to tell you about what's really going on. I'm going to tell you about what happened with my marriage 5 years ago and how this job started affecting my relationship with my children. I mean, could you imagine the power of something like that? And this is something that wouldn't cost agencies any money. They already have the staffing, they already have the people, they're there. But by doing that, it's going to have a domino effect where when that person opens up, now everyone, including that brand new rookie who just started a week ago, they're going to be like, holy cow, if the chief can do this, I can do this if I need to. And that's what's really going to change that culture and smash the stigma of asking for help. Because, like I said, as it is now, asking for help is looked at as a sign of weakness. It means that you can't handle the job. Maybe you shouldn't be in this field. Maybe you should consider another line of work. Instead of going, no, you're right. Like that call was messed up. I agree with you. Those feelings you're having right now, that's absolutely normal. Get it off your chest. Let's talk about it. That's how you do this.
Do you think there's any benefit to having like mandatory therapy? And I know there are resource issues, right, tied to that, but not that everybody has to go to therapy, on a regular monthly basis, right? That could be very costly and time consuming. But what if there was a law that like, if you have had exposure to a critical incident, it is mandatory. You have to see a therapist, a culturally informed therapist, ideally for X amount of sessions. And that way there's no stigma because now it's forced on you. Everybody has to do it. What do you think about that? What do you think that would be beneficial? What would be potential pitfalls?
I think there's pros and cons, honestly.
Yeah.
Because if I look back to when I was in my shooting, if I would have had mandatory therapy, I would have gone, but I wouldn't have told them anything. I would have just like I'm going to check the boxes because I want to go back to work, right?
You
So if
also
you
could have
make
been
it,
scared if you said the wrong thing to the therapist that they would have reported that and then you could have been out of a
yes,
job. Yeah.
and that's where the trust comes into because I think if you already have these established trusted relationships, then people will open up during those sessions. But if you just tell somebody, hey, you're going to go see this therapist, you've never met them, and I don't,
Hmm.
it doesn't matter if they're culturally competent. You say, hey, look, this therapist is great. They work with first responders. You're going to go see him for 4 sessions. Do you really think that that officer is going to open up? I mean, maybe some will, but I think most won't. Like I said, unless they
Hmm.
know for a fact that it's going to be private, it's going to be confidential, and that it's not going to have negative repercussions on their career. Because if you make it like a fit for duty thing, where you
Hmm.
say, hey, you were involved in this incident and you have to get through this many sessions of therapy. If you don't, you can no longer be a police officer. Or guess what? If while you're in those therapy sessions, if something comes out, you may not be a police officer anymore. And that's the problem is it's got to be a system where I want to say it's almost independent, but it's trusted to where like you're protected, to where
Hmm.
that for a fact that what you're talking about with this therapist is not going to go right back to your administration or to your HR department. Like
Right.
for when I started my process of recovery, I initially saw a contracted therapist. But the thing was, and this is good, is that a week or two after, I had to transition to an independent therapist who was not employed by the city or the
Hmm.
department or by HR, that wasn't connected at all. And that's what ensured for me that trust and that privacy. But when I think like, wait a minute, this therapist or this company contracts with my agency or with
Yeah.
my, state or my county, I'm going to start thinking like, well, who are they really working for? Are they working for me or are they working for the agency? So,
Right.
there's a lot of things that have to be worked out for this to happen. So, when you say mandatory, I kind of cringe at that. And I think most
Yeah.
people cringe when you say mandatory. Highly encouraged, supported, um, offering time off and days off and offering
Mm.
benefits that are positive to do this, like reinforcing it. I think that's a better idea, as opposed to making it almost like a punishment. Because when you say mandatory, I think like
Right.
punishment, I think like forced on me. But if I hear like, hey, you know what? We're going to give you 2 weeks off and you don't have to report to the department. You don't have to answer your phone. But we do ask that you go talk with this therapist 3 times. Okay. You can pick the time with her. It's only for an hour,
Hmm.
but you're going to get paid 2 weeks off. Okay. Because we want you to have some downtime. We want you to spend time with your family and we want you ready to come back to work. So you're incentivizing it. You're making it a positive experience as opposed to kind of like dangling something over your head to saying, if you don't do this,
Yeah.
then this negative thing is going to happen.
Okay, I'll never use the word mandatory again. Yeah,
Encouraged.
encouraged therapy. No, I
Yes,
think that's
highly,
excellent.
highly
And
encouraged.
yeah, and look, I mentioned to you previously that I've had a short stint with the police as an intern in Montgomery County in Maryland, where I grew up, and then I immigrated to Israel at the end of high school. So this was a high school internship. And I was in the domestic violence unit and I felt like a real badass. I had the little Kevlar vest on and I was riding around, in the police cars. And man, I gotta say, even though I didn't pursue a career with the police, it just gave me such a respect for what police officers go through because, I was coming to them. I was coming with the officers to the scenes and then I was helping, in the background, like filing evidence and in paperwork for courts. And, just as an intern, this stuff that I saw, I was like, whoa, like how do people do this for 10, 20 years? And I did have, and I'm a very empathetic person. I did have a wall up while I was doing, this internship, but I was like, could I do that long term? I don't know. And what kind of effect would that have on me? What kind of support would I need? I thought about all these things, right? Um, that's not ultimately why I didn't join the police. It just had to do with other things going on, with my life and career path in Israel. But yeah, it's just kind of like I try to go back to that mindset of that very short time that I spent with the police and to see things through their, eyes. And I absolutely understand people who see themselves as warriors, not just physically strong, but mentally strong, like being told, hey, you have to do this. I can see how that's going to backfire with this crowd. But at the same time, like just normalizing it and incentivizing, I think that was, very key and very practical what you recommended. So um finishing up, what is your message of hope to other police officers suffering from mental health issues in silence? What is your advice to them?
My advice is if you're out there, struggling in silence, thinking that you're alone, that nobody's going to understand how you're feeling, no one's going to get it. I assure you that you're wrong. There's actually countless people out there who will understand it, who will be there to help you. I struggled in silence for 4 years, to the point where it almost cost my life. And I had no hope. I was literally in the darkest depths and I saw nothing, and I couldn't even imagine that I could ever recover from this. But looking back now, having the strength and courage to ask for help, and it was the most brave and courageous thing I've ever done in my life was asking for help. And it wasn't easy. I'm not here to tell you that it's going to be easy. There was a lot of ups and downs. There was good days and bad days. There were setbacks. but I'm now on the other side of post-traumatic stress injury. And I have a whole new life. I have an amazing life. I mean, I look at everything differently. I'm actually present today. I'm here. I'm a better father. I'm a better partner. I'm a better brother. And just know that if you get that strength and courage to ask for help, it will get better.
Absolutely. Michael, thank you so much for sharing your story, for sharing your insights, also your practical recommendations that I know will be helpful to others. And I look forward to being in touch. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Thanks for having me on.